have tissues, so just...
Oh, wow.
It's going to get real, guys. It's going to get real. Good morning, everyone. Good morning for those of you joining us from home. Good morning to the beautiful people sitting in front of me. Even in your masks, I see your beauty. If you were not with us last week, we are doing a series on Lamentations. We are pausing our lectionary series, and we felt led to do a series on Lamentations. If you want to know why in the world we would think it would be a good idea to talk about Lamentations right now, there is a YouTube video in which Bud and I sit down and we have really good banter for about 30 minutes about why it is that we're choosing to do Lamentations during this season in our history. So if you want to know why, you can watch that video. To give you just a short little blurb about why, there's a lot happening in 2020, okay? I went to try and find a 2020 ornament for our family this year, and the cynical cuss words and it was just very hard to find a positive 2020 ornament, so I think we're just gonna embrace the hard of it and get, a little ornament that has the Grinch on it that says stink, stank, stunk. So there you go. There's my little, just a little blurb about why we're doing Lamentations. It's healthy, you guys. But Lori kicked us off beautifully last week. She talked about Lamentations, invites us and gives us permission to radical truth-telling, to be radically honest. And not only that, we serve a God who welcomes all of that. All of our emotions, all of our angers and frustration and grief and loss, and God just says, yeah, bring it all to the table. And she just did a beautiful job with that. So in the spirit of truth-telling this morning, I am going to let you guys know that this whole series has been an extremely hard struggle for me. I am not good at truth-telling, at least not full truth-telling. I'm really good at deceiving myself about how I feel about things. If you know anything about the Enneagram, I am a 3, and we're really good at deceiving ourselves. So this has been a struggle. Being able to sit with the really hard and uncomfortable truths has been a struggle. And I wanted to come to this Lamentations series, and specifically Lamentations 2, when I found out that this was the one that I was assigned to preach. I wanted to be like, okay, I'm going to read Lamentations 2, and I'm going to get my answers. I want to know why, and I want to know now, and I want to know it concretely so that I can move on. But what I have found, and I'm still learning this, you guys, is that it is okay if I can't find a satisfying answer to my questions. Not only that, maybe it's okay to end with more questions than I started with. And maybe it's more than okay. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's good to just have more questions. Maybe it's okay to sit in some discomfort. And maybe what that does is get me used to sitting with some mystery. Because what I have discovered as I've been reading through this section of Scripture is that I don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. The table, the communion table that we came to at the front end of this service, that is our answer. And I'm going to explain that as we go along. And I'm going to start by reading Lamentations 2. I'm going to read all 22 all 22 verses. So it will be on the screen if you want to follow along, or if you want to follow along if you brought your Bibles or your apps, or if you just want to sit and listen. Either way, it's going to be Lamentations 2, 1 through 22. How the Lord in his anger has humiliated daughter Zion. He has thrown down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has destroyed without mercy all the dealings of Jacob. In his wrath, he has broken down the strongholds of daughter Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand from them in the face of the enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe. He has killed all in whom we took pride, in the tent of daughter Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has destroyed Israel. He has destroyed all its palaces, laid in ruins its strongholds, and multiplied in daughter Judah mourning and lamentation. He has broken down his booth like a garden. He has destroyed his tabernacle. The Lord has abolished in Zion festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. A clamor was raised in the house of the Lord, as on the day of festival. The Lord determined to lay in ruins the walls of daughter Zion. He stretched the line. He did not withhold his hand from destroying. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Her king and princes are among the nations. Guidance is no more, and her prophets obtain no vision from the Lord. The elders of daughter Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young girls of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of my people, because infants and babes faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" as they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. What can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughters Jerusalem? To what can I liken you, that I may find comfort, O virgin daughter of Zion? For vast as the sea is your ruin, who can heal you? Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have been oracles for you that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at daughter Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of the earth? All your enemies open their mouths against you. They hiss, they gnash their teeth. They cry, "We have devoured her. Ah, this is the day we longed for. At last we have seen it." The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his threat. He has ordained, as he had ordained long ago, he has demolished without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes. Cry aloud to the Lord, O wall of daughter Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Lord, and consider, to whom have you done this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have borne? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? The young and the old are lying on the ground in the streets. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. In the day of your anger, you have killed them, slaughtering without mercy. You invited my enemies from all around, as if for a day of festival. And on the day of the anger of the Lord, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I bore and reared, my enemy has destroyed. Just a bit of light reading for this morning. We really see and hear the anguish of the author of Lamentations. And the biggest thing that jumped out at me as I read and reread this text was, and I'm going to show you literally what I did. Wait. Are we saying that God is the source of suffering? Because that sure is what it seems like the author is saying to us in this text. Over and over, we see the author saying, the Lord has done something. The Lord has destroyed. The Lord has scorned his altar, destroyed his tabernacle. He's determined to lay ruin. Over and over again, we see God acting to bring about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the city that God provided for God's people. We see God bringing destruction against the very temple in which the Israelites believed God dwelled. God destroyed the people. God destroyed the land. And God destroyed the festivals and the ability to continue in the ritual worship that the people had enjoyed for many generations. So is that what we see in this? Is the author of Lamentations saying, God, you are the source of our suffering? This author gets real. And he seems to be really comfortable with being that real and that honest with God in a way that I balk immediately. I can't say that. God's not the source of suffering. That's not the God that I have experienced. How can this author just lay it all out there and say, God, this is your fault? And I've wrestled with that, you guys. So can we say after reading this that God is the source of suffering? The author, even and if you read verse 17, says, the Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his threat that he ordained long ago. So what is that? Lori told us a little bit about the history of what happened with Israel. They came into the land and they had this covenant relationship with God in which God says, do these things, follow these decrees, and let me tell you the blessings I'm going to pour out on you, my people, when you follow these decrees. In Deuteronomy 28, he talks about this. And I'm going to focus on this sort of hinge passage in verse 15, where the voice of the Lord says, but if you don't obey the Lord your God's voice by carefully doing all of his commandments and his regulations that I'm commanding you right now, all of these curses come upon you and they find you. And then the rest of the chapter lists the curses that are going to happen to the people of Israel if they do not follow the commands of God. Laid out there. So when the author, who we assume is Jeremiah, says, you've done what you purposed, you threatened us with the curses of destruction and exile, and you're following through on the promises you made us in Deuteronomy. So what if instead of thinking about it in terms of God as the source of suffering, what if we can look at it in terms of God is faithful to God's promises? Right? We can find in a narrative form, the recounting of the destruction and the exile in 2 Kings, 25. So if you want to go back and read that, we see you can kind of look at the Deuteronomy text and look at the 2 Kings, and they're like, yeah, no, that tracks. All of the curses that were promised are now coming to fruition here in this 2 Kings passage. I'm not going to read through that for time's sake, but it's interesting to see that. And so what if we can frame it not as, God, you're the source of suffering, but what if, God, you are faithful to your promises? And if we can see that God is faithful to the promises of justice, is not also God faithful to bring restoration? So we serve a God who's faithful in justice and faithful to be with us in restoration. Because we see that we have the perspective, we have that, hindsight, where we know that when people went into exile, they were like, well, the presence of God has left us. We are in exile. There's no place for the presence of God to dwell. The temple's been destroyed. Our enemies destroyed it. God allowed it to happen. But what we know is that the presence of God actually followed the people into exile. We have this accounting in Daniel of the way that God was present with these people in Babylon, not in Israel, not in Jerusalem, but the presence of God went with them. It just didn't look the way they thought it was going to look. And then we see a return 70 plus years later and a rebuilding of the temple. So not only was God faithful in the justice towards the Israelite community, but God was faithful in the restoration. And I think that that's a really beautiful and healthy perspective to think about as we think about this passage and as we wrestle with these ideas about, did God cause suffering? But again, in the spirit of radical truth-telling, this answer doesn't always satisfy me. Sounds real good, sounds really good, and I can hold on to it most days, but there are days when it doesn't satisfy me. And I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to tell you it in the form of my story. I'm already starting to cry, so we're just going to go with it. On June 22nd, 2020, I went to a neurosurgeon because I was having migraine headaches and I got an MRI. And I went to the neurosurgeon because I knew some action was needed. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was walking into. My husband and I went into the doctor's office completely unprepared for the news that we were about to receive. And that was that I had a baseball-sized tumor right here inside my head that, frankly, they were surprised I wasn't having seizures. It had become extremely debilitating, and to find out that this was the answer to a lot of my pain and suffering was a bit of a relief. But I remember sitting with the surgeon, and I think Bud might recount this story from his perspective at some point, but the surgeon said, well, we don't want to wait to get this out now that we know that this is here, so I have an opening for surgery tomorrow. Are you free? So I said, Bud was like, wait. And I was like, yes, let's do this. I know this thing is in my brain, so let's get this done as soon as possible. And the surgeon went on to tell me some of the risks, as they are required to do whenever you go into any type of surgery or procedure. And he said a lot of different things that I was at risk for. So because of the placement of the tumor, the two main things that I had the potential to lose the ability to do was to use my hands and to speak. So I sat there taking in this information. By the way, the risk of death was very, very low for this procedure. Apparently, cutting into someone's head is not a big deal. So we went home. We announced to our community, to our elder team, we did all of the things. And I called my mom and said, you must fly in today. They live in California. My mom and dad came. We got all those arrangements done. Oh, by the way, we were also moving. It's fine. It was a crazy week. But I remember sitting on the front porch after we had sort of gotten all the arrangements done that we needed to do. And I just had this moment sitting on our porch swing. And I said, okay, God, we got to talk. Because I just found my voice. I just found my voice. And it is not okay if it is taken away from me. Not okay with it. So we got to figure this out. Because if I wake up from this surgery and I can no longer speak, you're going to have to do something. Because I'm not okay with it. And we just had a little come to Jesus moment right then on my front porch. And I went inside and I spent a wonderful time with my little family. And we have wonderful neighbors who the kids went to their house so that Bud and I could have a nice evening together before I got dropped off for surgery at 5 a.m. I'm standing before you a miracle because I do have my voice. And I do have hands that are able to type and write and do all of the things that are required of me as a wife, a mother, a pastor. But let me tell you some things that I struggled with leading up to the surgery and after the surgery. I heard these things a lot. You know, everything happens for a reason, Melody. Just think about the stories you'll be able to tell. It's all going to be okay because, God's in it, Melody, so you're just going to be fine. And I just remember being like, thank you. But in my mind, I'm like, nope. That's not going to cut it for me. Your answer does not satisfy me. But I'll tell you what did help. You guys, my ecclesia community, came alongside our family. And you didn't say any of those words to us. You provided meals for us. You came and sat with us, with my family. You provided us the ability to get our house clean. You spoke words of real comfort in the form of, yeah, this sucks and I don't know, but here I am. What do you need? So thank you for that. Ecclesia, my community, you guys are amazing and really got us through this very traumatic time for us. And my story ends in what you could call triumph. They thought there was going to be cancer and I was going to have to go through radiation treatments and possibly chemotherapy, depending on what they found. I'm blanking on the name, but the cancer doctor, whatever he's called, he was like, the way your MRI lit up, I'm shocked that there's no cancer. So apparently it was a pretty scary looking tumor. But we got the pathology back and there was no cancer, no radiation. I'm obviously able to speak and to use my hands, which sometimes is good and is other times distracting. I have to get an MRI once a year, and that's it, just to make sure nothing comes back. So you can call my story a triumph. What a triumph. Look at the faithfulness of God to be faithful, to bring me through this, and to bring restoration out of it, right? So you could say, you have nothing to lament, Melody. But what I have found is that there are still things that I need to lament. I still have to wrestle with God. God and I talk about this. This is what I say. Why did this have to happen to me? Why did I have to have the tumor? If everything was going to end up fine at the end of all of this, why did I have to go through it? Why? Not fair. Could have learned the lessons that I learned some other way, I'm convinced. And there's this little small voice in the back of my head that says, oh, Melody, because you deserved the brain tumor. Did I, though? No. An even louder voice says that. No, I did not deserve the tumor, because that's not the God that we serve. We don't serve a God who has a balance sheet. And I do something so, in return, you get a brain tumor. That's not the God that we serve. That's not the God that I have experienced. And that's not a God of love. Ray Hollenbach, he is a a Vineyard church leader, and he has this beautiful saying, and it says, "Not everything happens for a reason, but God brings reason to everything that happens." In other words, God restores the things that have been broken. God is faithful to bring restoration out of the things that have happened in our lives. Because I don't believe that God caused my tumor, but what I do believe is that I was born into a broken world in which brain tumors exist, cancer exists, illness, COVID exists. And I can hold on to the idea and the thought that God is faithful to bring restoration, even in those moments where that answer doesn't quite satisfy. So there's my personal story of lament. But I want to bring it back to the Israelite community. So I'm kind of doing a individual, then we're going to look at like the larger, bring it back to the larger corporate scale, because the reality is there are things that we lament individually, and we're called also to lament corporately. So let's bring it back to Israel, because they're asking some questions. Just like I was asking some questions, they're asking some questions of God. Why have you brought this suffering on us? Because here's the thing that we need to know about Israel. Israel assumed that all of their enemies were God's enemies, and God was always on the side of the Israelites. The Israelites were God's people. God had created a covenant relationship with them. God was on their side. And then all of a sudden, they were no longer defeating their enemies. The enemies were coming in and defeating them, and they're like, what is happening? I thought, God, that you were always on our side, and what this looks like right now is that you are actually our enemy. In fact, in this passage, in this very chapter, the author says, God, you look like an enemy right now, after the destruction of our city. And as I kind of reflected on earlier, this idea of remembering our history, I think it's important here for Israel to remember their history, in that this is part of the faithfulness of God in fulfilling God's promises. Like, it was like, God was like, yeah, guys, I told you what it was going to take. And you chose to listen to the prophets that told you guys were great. And you either killed or exiled the prophets who were telling you that you needed to shape up. They were not willing to hear about their real, true history. They wanted to just hear words of comfort when what they needed was words of discomfort to maybe reckon with their real history. And I want to encourage us this morning to reflect on what this could possibly mean for the American church. Because I think the American church is in the middle of a reckoning. I talked about this several weeks ago when I talked about the apocalypse as the unveiling. I think what has happened in this year, 2020, is that the veil has been lifted and some very real weaknesses in our church have come to light. And it's time for us to choose either to believe the words of the false prophets that say that we're fine and we're good, or to believe the voices that are saying, guys, we have got to reckon with our actual history. We have to be radical truth tellers about what we as the American church have been complicit in. Because what we are seeing is really bad fruit of decisions that the American church has been making. And I just want to say this because I think it's important. I say this about the American church not because I hate it, but because I love it and I grieve for it and I lament for it, because we're not where we need to be. We assume that because we go to church and proclaim Jesus' name, that Jesus and God is on our side. But I think what is slowly being revealed is that God is grieving the American church. And we as American Christians don't know what to do when we're losing. We don't know what to do. Always be winning is a really great thing that we could say, that we have taught. We've been taught as Americans, we're winners. We always be winning. And even when we're losing, we spin it somehow to say, well, maybe we didn't win that, but it was a draw, so it doesn't count. Right? We have this idea that the American church is seeing the favor of God. And we don't know how to reckon with the ways that we have allowed American individualism and triumphalism infiltrate so deeply into our church, so deeply into the body of Christ, that we don't know what to do when things get bad. We want to ignore the bad stuff, and we just want to be triumphal. Let's spin it. Let's spin everything. That's why when people are like, well, Melody, God's going to spin this around and make it good without allowing me to sit in the pain of the fact that I had a brain tumor. Those dear, well-intentioned friends wanted to move past the pain and get to the triumph at the end. But you got to sit in the pain, and you have to sit in the suffering. You have to do it. It's the way that real healing comes. And we don't know what to do with that. We don't know what to do with the pain and the suffering that we, as the American church, have been complicit in. The church has been complicit in silencing women, showing hate and judgment to those on the margins, drawing hard lines in the sands, partnering with power instead of walking in the footsteps of Christ, to name a few. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to be Christ's followers when we look at a suffering Jesus. We don't know what to do with that. Prophetic Lament, the book that we're reading that inspired this series, the author says, the narrative of triumph silences a narrative of suffering. It doesn't just push it to the side, it says, no, you're not allowed to suffer because triumph, because resurrection, which is true, but you have to die first before resurrection comes. And what Lamentations 2, and the whole book, I would argue, does is embraces the reality of suffering. It doesn't shy away from it. It goes so far as to say, God, it looks like you're the source. It looks like you're the enemy right now, and we are not okay with that. It gives us permission to voice our suffering. And if I can give us some hope this morning, I hope that I can. I hope that I can give us some hope this morning, is the thing that I said at the front end of this service. And that is, we can come with our questions. We can embrace the suffering. And we can come to a God who is not only not scared of the honesty of our suffering and our pain, but embraces it also and knows what it means to suffer. Knows what it is to suffer. Because that's what the communion table is, right? In the Corinthians passage that we read this morning to prepare us for communion, it says, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Paul didn't say we proclaim his resurrection. At the table, we're proclaiming his death until he comes. So at the table, we don't find answers to our questions. We find a Jewish Palestinian brown man that was lynched. And we're invited to that broken table. It's not a table of triumph, it's a table of brokenness. And so we come with our questions, and what we find there is a God who knows what it is to suffer. God's faithfulness and God's justice come together at the cross. And that's the lens that we see God through. These are hard words. Asking a group of people to sit in discomfort and mystery and questions and suffering before God is hard to do, which is why we are able to do it in community.